that they can report with objectivity and without fear, as it were. If the internal auditor is able to be objective and report fearlessly without having to take the protection of the audit committee, I don't think it is critical then for the man to report to the chairman of the audit committee or whatever. Because let me also be more realistic about this. The internal auditor and the chairman of the audit committee interact 6 days, 8 days, 10 days in a year. The other 355 days of the year, he doesn't have the chairman of the audit committee to run to. So he has to stand on his own legs and he has to deal with the people around him. And I think it would be a poor organization where the chairman of the audit committee or the whole audit committee has to constantly go out there and defend the internal auditor. Perhaps we shouldn't have an internal audit in such an organization because it's not being understood or appreciated adequately. So I think the important thing is the ability of the internal auditor to do what he should do. I don't, that survey said less than 50%, but to come back to your question, I think certainly the trend is more towards reporting to the chairman of the audit committee, but what do we mean by that? Does the chairman of the audit committee or the audit committee have a deciding voice in the future of that individual in the company? Does the chairman of the audit committee say, now he shall become the finance director, he's been chief internal auditor for 5 years, damn good job, we make him finance director. No, we make him the managing director. He hasn't that power. So what real protection can he give to the internal auditor? Ultimately, the internal auditor has to carry management along with him. And if he is a good internal auditor, if he's constructive, if he's not arrogant or whatever, as some of you said, I think he will achieve that. And at the end of his 4 years, 3 years, 5 years, whatever, management itself will say that let's promote him to something else. And otherwise he'll languish forever as the internal auditor. That's what I think.
I just want to supplement. I think the way it's done can be that you ensure that the audit committee chairman and members of the audit committee are accessible to the chief internal auditor. The way that is that at any time they can reach out, he or she can reach out to the chairman of the audit committee or the audit committee members. And because this matrix organization will always be there. There will be dual reporting. We have to live with these ambiguities because we cannot really have it such a cut and dry type of a thing. Because you have to really work with the CEO and the CFOs and the CXOs of the organization. You have to work with them. Because ultimately, the quality of the auditee is as important as the quality of the auditor. So therefore, let's not only emphasize on one side. Because they also need to understand, therefore, the process of education is very critical. As to all these issues are all constructive challenges are being thrown only because to create value in the organization. So it's a culture which has got to be developed over a period of time, right? So the organization slowly sort of graduate into this position. These things don't happen overnight. Because even long ago, we used to talk about only transactions checking. Today, we have come a long way from that. It's not just transaction checking. Today, systems and processes, risk-based auditing, identifying what kind of risks are there and so on. I just want to also respond on this M&A issue. See, very often, what do you do in M&A? An internal auditor is not part of the decision to say that whether you should acquire or not acquire. It's very clearly, as Naushir said, that it is a strategic issue. Right? The management has really decided, the board has really approved it, and we are really going ahead. Very often, the due diligence is not really given to your internal auditor. He's hard-pressed. So the due diligence is really done through an external agency and so on. But at some appropriate stage, before it has really gone too far, a chief auditor can really go with the resources, very, very quickly identify the gaps, and then come back and really say that, guys, you really acquired this. These are the kind of issues which I've really observed, but really put some safeguards in place, and so that there is a fair chance that your acquisition can be very successful. Because globally it is known that 70% of the acquisitions have failed to deliver the promised value, right? So you can really use these very effectively. So the audit must be used, audit function must be used as a powerful management resource. Right? And that is, so therefore, how the chief executive behaves towards this whole process is as important to me.
Thank you. Mario, a question to you is that, while it's clear that internal audit is moving up the value chain, it at times also poses a conundrum of sorts of balancing between sort of, providing a high-level view to senior management and, getting your hands dirty by going into the details. The reason I say that is that with the sort of heightened emergence of sort of frauds that are coming up in the Indian context as well, it's often the details and the trending in the detail that gives you the indicator that there is something wrong. So how do you have your teams balance out this need to get into the detail to find these issues, at the same time being high level and sort of giving those two-page reports to management? How do you get your teams and how do you get your juniors to sort of maintain that balance?
So a lot of this really comes from a trained eye. The kind of frauds that one sees today, if we're talking about whether internal audit is the right agency or rather whether all frauds should be detected through internal audit reports, the kind of frauds that come out are not things which are little process weaknesses. They are deliberate acts. And where deliberate acts sometimes is very difficult to find out. So if I were to just give you an example, take a case, let us say, of somebody who has fudged the inventory records. And let us say that closing stock physically verified is fudged by fiddling with the tags. You may or may not find out, if you do a very detailed analysis of the tags, by looking at whether quantity have been altered by adding a digit before or after. But there's another method that we have found very effective, where using system support, we find out when the first level of entries were keyed in, when corrections to those entries were keyed in. So at least you're able to watch for trends. You're able to see if something has happened after the first level of entries were made, in a sense to see whether you're trying to match then the book records with the physical, because you must not forget that people keying in the data will be quite different from people who have recourse to the books. So just coming back therefore to the question, it needs a trained eye, and that is why you have different levels in the department. You have the youngsters who have got a trained eye as far as technology is concerned, and they are able to access technology, and they're able to find a lot of things. And I'll tell you that from experience, I can tell you they're very, very observant, and they're very quick to point out trends. And then you have the seniors who by experience know that something could have gone wrong when you see a pattern of the kind that you're seeing. Together, if you put the picture together, then it's a question of whether you're joining the dots rightly or whether you're joining the dots wrongly. And you do see a picture according to me.
Okay.
Can I just
Sure.
make an observation on that? The kind of frauds that the board is concerned with, because certainly there are frauds in inventory and petty cash, and they happen all the time. The kind of frauds, and just look at the 3 public frauds that have happened in the last 10 years in India. The first one perhaps was Tata Finance, where this man was alleged to have put a whole lot of his stock trading losses into a subsidiary, or Satyam, or the latest one, that footwear, Reebok. All of them, I mean, you have to be blind not to be able to see that if you looked at the balance sheet of these 3 companies. There was nothing more needed. There were 3 big, each of these companies had a huge asset sitting there, which anyone who didn't even need to be a trained accountant should have just asked, what is this asset and what is the substance to that asset? Receivables in 2 cases, bank deposits in another. It's a stupid thing. And what is the reason for that? Because all management is focused on the revenue account. I sit in quarterly report. The companies don't even present the balance sheet. The audit committee doesn't see the quarterly balance sheet. They get the quarterly P&L account because the stock exchange rules require publication of the quarterly numbers, and all the frauds are being swept into the balance sheet. And by the time anyone looks at, people have even lost the ability to understand the balance sheet because they only look at the P&L account. And really, it's not a very difficult thing. It's just simple common sense for the kind of frauds boards are worried about. Sure, there's a lot of other frauds that happen, but I don't think in the board we get very unduly upset if a couple of crores here or there in a 10,000 crore business has got stolen over a few years. That happens. It's part of the cost of doing business.
Thank you. Mrs. Sundaram, at the end of the day, let's face it.
I hope it's the end of the day.
all IA teams have to deal with realities of corporate funding of their initiatives. While you were the finance director of HUL, what was your approach towards approving internal audit budgets, and how do you define, ROI of sorts on that?
Frankly, it's a non-issue to me. Frankly, it's a non-issue to me. See, to really sit down and the importance of anything is best appreciated sometimes in its absence, not in its presence. Right? Here is a function which is not only has to play a hygienic role, it has to also play a value-added role. So therefore, at the end of the day, we never approached it to say that, no, let's just cut it down, kind of a thing. It had to be substantiated with what kind of resources would be needed to cover a complex business. Or then we really say that supposing if across the company, if you're really taking, let's say, a 5% cut, let's say in overheads, what are those areas where we can afford to live with the risk so that we need to really have less outsourcing rather than what was previously. So it was really from that point of view we really approached it. So it was never a constraint. The constraint always be to get a high quality people. That a high quality leader as your chief internal auditor or chief control assurance, and if you're outsourcing, which we did, to ensure that no rookies are coming into it, but only good experienced people are put into it, really handled the business, who understood the business, who really sort of had a flair for the processes and so on and so forth. So that's how, so I was not really unduly concerned about what it is. I mean, it is fine.
Okay. So, yeah. I will have time for maybe one or two questions to the panel if anybody from the audience would want to ask a question.
In one of the IIA conferences, thought had come up that the lowest level of auditors who actually work for these observations, they should once in a year meet the top management, maybe the board of directors or the audit committee members, just to know that from their eyes how they see the year, how they would want the auditors to come up with, what they want the auditors to come up with for the year. After that, some more discussions came in that such a conversation with the top management is required so that the required quality of work is given, and actually it is given in the way the top management wants. The second opinion came up that it is not required because the requisite hierarchy is there between the low-level auditor and the top management, maybe in the form of CIA or the level below the CIA, who will actually pour down these thoughts to the working level auditors. So my question to you all as CIA and CEO is, what do you feel on this?
Mario, would you want to take that? Would you want your team to be in front of the audit committee annually, or are you the conduit of their expectations to your team?
Well, I think, again, this can work both ways. So within the team, whether they want to meet the audit committee chairman, I need to ask them that first. Because very often teams take shelter under the team manager and then the senior and then the chief internal auditor. But keeping that aside, it is indeed a good practice that not just the chairman of the audit committee, but that the entire audit committee meets the audit team. That would, of course, mean some more time that the audit committee has to spend, which I'm sure they would be prepared to spend. But going further, why not you have the CEO, the CFO, and you have those in positions of management spending time and explaining their point of view? Because quite often, there is a little frustration sometimes where the management believes that all that these internal audit guys have to do is to point out what is wrong, what is wrong, what is wrong. So it's nice to hear a perspective, not just from the audit committee, but also from members of senior management.
Just taking a lead from what we were discussing as to whom should an internal auditor report. So in case internal auditor is reporting to the board, doesn't the panel think that it would be much better that it is reporting to the audit committee? Because audit committee can give him insights. Board will be giving a strategic input which actually on field will help the internal auditor, but not to that extent. The actual input has to come from the business. So if we say, like we were discussing earlier, if we alienate this, as we take internal audit as a statutory audit function, which reports to the board and ultimately it goes ahead. So will that kind of reporting help our internal audit? I wanted to know what does the panel think? Or is it better if the internal audit function is reporting to the audit committee, because audit committee gives the internal auditor the insight that probably stat auditor does not need, because he's looking at the books, he's looking at the figures, he's saying this book is according to these figures and going ahead, which internal auditor cannot, because there may be some businesses, there may be small businesses which does not come onto the books, so there's no way that an internal auditor can get those unless the audit committee or somebody, say CEO, explains it to him, unless he takes it otherwise from the whistleblower or something.
See, one practice I can just tell you, I don't know whether it may answer your question or may not answer. I can say that a good practice by many audit committees these days is to have a discussion with both the statutory auditors and the chief internal auditor or internal auditor without the presence of the management. It's invariably once in 6 months or every quarter if they want to, that you ask the management, which includes CFO and his team and whoever else is there and so on, to have a meeting only with the statutory auditors to really get an assurance as to how the company has responded to their needs, their information, and so on and so forth, cooperation and so on. Similarly, audit committees tend to have an independent meeting with the internal auditor, so that then the whole reporting issues, etc., are not there. There is a fair bit of confidently, the person can really share if there are any concerns in confidence, and then the audit committee and the chairman of the audit committee can pick this up further with the top management. If necessary, the audit committee can enlist the support of the board. It may not be necessary, really. Audit committee is powerful enough to really sort of tell the management as to what it really feels, what ought to be really done. And that's, I think, is a good practice. But this reporting issue seems to be quite live from the discussion that I'm gathering. I honestly feel that it really works perfectly well where the internal audit function is very much an integral part of, let us say, CEO, CFO team, but has a complete access to the audit committee and the audit committee chairman. Therefore, you can really say that there is a dual reporting in that sense. But the accessibility of the audit committee to the internal auditor at any time is very important in letter and spirit. That's very, very critical, so that in terms of any stress, he is able to reach out and really seek support and help.
I'll give Mr. Pinge the last question.
Sir, this question is for Mr. Mirza. Mirza is on many boards as independent directors. Sir, two things. Performance of an internal auditor. What is your view? What is the best practice? Should it be done by the chair of audit committee, or it should be done jointly with the chairman of the audit committee and the CEO? Or CEO should do it on its own? That's one. And basically, what exactly are the parameters,